In this lesson, we'll try to seek an answer to this question: can understanding the brain make us better learners? And we will say most definitely yes. Now, this lesson will assume knowledge of system consolidation that I covered in a previous lesson. So here we are, our first study session. We've got a sheet of neurons here. This will represent the cerebral cortex, various sensory areas in the cortex, maybe the visual cortex and the touch cortex and the auditory cortex. And we've got our hippocampus down here. When we study, there will be an allocation process in the sensory cortices here. So certain neurons within those areas are going to be allocated and assigned to make a memory trace of the information that we're learning. In addition, activity in these cortical areas is sent down into the hippocampus. So there's a convergence of these different sensory aspects of the learning event. The hippocampus will bind them together, forming a hippocampal memory trace. So there's another allocation process happening in the hippocampus, and those hippocampal neurons will strengthen the connections with each other to form a memory trace. We're left with a strong memory trace in the hippocampus due to high plasticity among neurons in the hippocampus, but only a weak memory trace up in the cortex. Now, when we retrieve memories, then the hippocampal memory trace acts like an index, and then is needed at this early stage to reactivate the cortical parts of the memory trace. So at this early stage, we need the hippocampal memory trace to reactivate the cortical memory trace, and that's what's needed for memory retrieval. But retrieval may be unsuccessful. So after only one learning event, retrieval might fail if the cortical memory traces are not successfully reactivated. It may well be that we just have weak memory traces all around. We may not have formed a strong hippocampal memory trace, as well as having weak cortical memory traces. In fact, this is one way of thinking about forgetting. We're going to call this as forgetting as insufficient consolidation. It may well be that because we weren't paying close attention or we're stressed out or whatnot, that we do not make strong hippocampal memory traces. So a lack of attention and stress can interfere with plasticity in the hippocampus. And if we're not paying attention as well, we're not going to be setting up good cortical memory traces as well. So it may be that we have just not formed strong memory traces in the hippocampus and extremely weak memory traces in the cortex. Which means then, if we don't have a strong hippocampal memory trace, then our frontal cortex retrieval systems are left to activate very weak cortical memory traces, and this can often fail. So this is an example of forgetting due to insufficient consolidation. We didn't create a strong hippocampal memory trace, and we were left with very weak cortical memory traces. So if we're going to have long-term memory, we must strengthen these weak cortical memory traces. And let's assume now, though, that we did make a strong memory trace in the hippocampus because we were paying attention and we were not stressed out. We were ready to learn. So scientists have discovered that an important process happens during sleep, system consolidation. The hippocampus is a fast learner. With one learning trial, you can have a lot of plasticity here, make strong memory traces, and that makes the hippocampus a good teacher for the purpose of system consolidation. So what happens during sleep? We reactivate the day's learning, the memory traces that were formed during the day. Those memory traces, when they're reactivated, they will activate the connected cortical memory traces, and the effect of that is to strengthen those cortical memory traces. So with every system consolidation that happens during sleep, we have the opportunity to strengthen cortical memory traces, which represents our learned information for the material we were studying. Now, interestingly, the flip side of system consolidation in strengthening cortical memory traces is scientists suspect that sleep is also going to be weakening the hippocampal memory traces. Now, to see the logic of that, take a look at this picture. Here we have the hippocampus down here after a day's learning. So we've learned a bunch of things. A set of the synapses have been strengthened. Hippocampus is good at fast growth here that represents learning after one learning event. But these synapses must be reset to a baseline strength for new learning to occur. You see, there may be a limit to how strong a synapse can get. And once synapses get to a certain strength, you can't strengthen them anymore. But if all of these hippocampal synapses get saturated, get maxed out, then the hippocampus will not be prepared to learn anything new. So we've got to have a hippocampus that has, sort of baseline strength synapses here that have the potential to be strengthened for new learning. But wait a second, if you're going to weaken these synapses during sleep, you better have already done your system consolidation to save the memories in the cortex, as it were, using a computer analogy. So system consolidation then is needed to strengthen the cortical memory traces so that sleep can weaken the hippocampal synapses in preparation for new learning. So sleep consolidates the memory in the cortex, but also weakens the hippocampal synapses in preparation for new learning. Now along comes our second study session. So we're going to be encoding the information, and notice up in the cortex then, if we're studying the same information, it'll be a lot of the same memory traces being reactivated. So during the second study session, we recognize the concepts we studied before. We talked about recognition. That requires that we have encountered the information before. You don't recognize something you're seeing for the first time. Now this involves activating the same cortical memory traces that were activated during the first study session. But notice down here in the hippocampus, it might well be a different set of hippocampal neurons that get activated to make the memory trace for the second learning event. So we're showing that as this blue triangle here representing 3 other hippocampal neurons that have been activated by the second study session. So notice it may be the same cortical memory traces that are activated by the same information you're studying, but a different hippocampal memory trace is being formed. Now, why would this be? Well, we learned earlier that scientists suspect that the most excitable hippocampal neurons at the time of the learning are the ones most likely to be activated and form a memory trace of that unique learning event. But once hippocampal neurons are activated, they tend to remain in a highly excited state for a little while, which means that the next learning event that happens a moment later, there's likely to be overlap in the allocated neurons in the hippocampus. So memory traces for events close in time will likely share allocated neurons, and this allows the brain to link events that happen together. So this is thought to be a feature of the brain, not a bug, that as we learn something, a certain set of neurons are allocated in the hippocampus, but when we learn something right after that, there's going to be overlap of those memory traces, and that allows those two memories to be connected, as it were, to be linked together in time. But as time goes by, a different population of hippocampal neurons will likely be most excitable. So if two events are widely separated in time, it's likely to be two separate hippocampal memory traces. Okay. After our second study session, we get to do system consolidation again. So whether it's the original teacher, as it were, or the new teacher, again, the hippocampus is going to be signaling the cortex to strengthen those cortical memory traces. And again, since it's the same memory traces in the second study session, we're building new growth on old growth. So we're actually making these same memory traces in the cortex stronger and stronger with each consolidation event. At the level of synapses then, here we see a synapse prior to learning. After the first consolidation, the spine is larger here, right? So we're not showing the synapse here, but we're kind of representing a stronger synapse. And with the second study session, we can build new growth on old growth. We can strengthen the synapse even more. So the more consolidation, the greater the growth. And these stronger synapses in the cortex, this is the long-term memory system. So with stronger synapses, we were making more durable memories in the cerebral cortex. Of course, we go on to study a third time and a fourth time and a fifth time or whatnot. Well, we're going to have multiple teachers then, strengthening those very same cortical memory traces so that we have well-stored information in the cerebral cortex. So multiple consolidations then will produce stronger cortical memory traces, making retrieval more successful and less dependent upon the hippocampus. So notice here we're suggesting that the frontal cortex memory systems now can successfully activate information in the cortex because it has been well consolidated. And that's a good state of affairs because the hippocampal memory traces are going to be decaying, and they will decay quickly. So even as the hippocampal memory traces decay, and we'll speak about why that is in a moment, we'll still have good access to well-consolidated memory traces in the cortex. But even if we have consolidated information into the cortex, we can still forget that information. So we're going to introduce another kind of forgetting. We're going to call it forgetting as a loss of access. After long periods of time without retrieval, we may lose access to the cortical memory traces, and this is another form of forgetting. We say loss of access here because a single study session can quickly restore reliable memory retrieval. And this means the memory traces were strong, but just not accessible. They were there, but we lost access to them. Now, what would be an example of this? Imagine you used to live at a certain residence with a certain address, and then you move. Well, when you were at the old address, you were there for a while, and you easily remembered your address, but then you move to the new place, and after a while you might forget the address of your old residence. But all it takes is somebody to remind you of that address, and you'll have quick and reliable access again. So the suggestion is that the knowledge of your old address was well stored in the cortex, but because you hadn't accessed it for a long time, you lost access to that knowledge, right? So there are retrieval pathways that have to be maintained to all the information in our cortex if we're going to have reliable access to that information. So then, to maintain reliable memory retrieval, we must first consolidate the memory, and it's a good idea to have multiple rounds of consolidation to make those cortical memory traces extra strong. But then we must also retrieve that memory every so often so as not to lose access to the stored information. So again, whenever we retrieve, it's an opportunity to strengthen the cortical memory traces. We've seen that in earlier lessons. The hippocampal memory trace will be used to reactivate cortical memory traces. And so that every time we activate a cortical memory trace, we give it the opportunity to strengthen synapses among those allocated neurons. And we're strengthening the cortical memory traces. But in addition, when we retrieve, we're strengthening the pathways, the retrieval pathways that have access to those cortical memory traces. So practicing retrieval strengthens the cortical memory traces and also the retrieval pathways to access those memory traces. So let's now, as we wrap up here, do a comparison between the hippocampal memory system and the cortical memory system. Hippocampal neurons are very plastic. They can grow strong synapses with one learning. We'll call that a fast growth process, and represented by the terminal getting bigger here. It's significantly bigger with just one learning episode. And this is a useful memory system. We can learn something once and make a strong hippocampal memory trace. On the other hand, the cortical neurons are less plastic, evidently. They grow strong synapses more slowly after multiple learning episodes. So in the cortex, it's different. They can grow strong connections as well. So they show plasticity, but the way they get there is different. They need multiple opportunities, multiple learning episodes to drive this stronger growth here. Let's look at decay. The hippocampal memory traces decay quickly, which allows for new learning. So here we saw this in the example of sleep here. So the hippocampus is good at learning, from one trial learning, but then if we're going to learn anything new in the hippocampus, we need to reset those synapses to some baseline level so that they can be strengthened again when we learn something new. In the cortex, cortical memory traces decay slowly, which allows for long-term retention of information. So here we see slow decay, and that is what allows us to store information for a lifetime in the cortex. So we want fast decay in the hippocampus in preparation for new learning, but we want slow decay in the cortex because this is our hard drive. This is our long-term memory system. We don't want these synapses getting weaker again. We don't want to weaken them because that is going to be weakening the cortical memory traces. So we've got a hippocampal system that has quick growth, but we reset the synapses during sleep. That prepares us for new learning. In the cortex, we need to activate these cortical neurons multiple times. We can get strong synapses, but then once we achieve strong synapses, they decay slowly, and that's ideal for a long-term memory system. Now, there are answers to the question of why our brains go through this system consolidation process, and I have other lessons about that. But very quickly, well, we want to store the memory traces in the cortex. There's just a lot more capacity for information storage in the cortex, more synapses, more information storage capacity. And then there are events happening in the hippocampus that will tend to disrupt and wipe away the memory traces from learned information here. So we've got to store information in the cortex because the hippocampus needs to be refreshed and ready for new learning. Again, you can check that out in other lessons. But we'll end here with this question. Why not just have high plasticity in the cortex? Right, so we said the hippocampus, those neurons have high plasticity. They respond with a lot of growth to just one learning episode. Then you can make strong memory traces here in the hippocampus with one learning episode. Why not just have hippocampal-like levels of plasticity in the cortex so that cortical neurons wouldn't need multiple activations to grow their synapses strong? Why not just have a cortex sort of made up of a whole bunch of hippocampal-type cells? Well, theoretically, then, it would be inefficient to learn and remember everything we encountered during the day, right? Almost by definition, useless information doesn't have survival value. So we don't have brains that are just sponges, that we just learn everything that happens to us during the day. From a numbers point of view, the cortex has capacity to store lots of information, but it's not infinite. There is a limit to synapse growth. There's a limit to the number of synapses we have up there and to how much growth can occur between those neurons. So you see, if cortical neurons responded like hippocampal neurons, then they would quickly saturate. New learning would be impossible. So we said the hippocampal neurons, they respond quickly with a lot of growth to one learning event. Well, if cortical neurons also did that, it would just be a matter of time before we sort of saturated all the cortical neurons, or all the synapses. And if all the cortical synapses are strengthened to their maximum level, then we wouldn't be able to learn and store any new information in the cortex. So we want our long-term memory system to be selective about what gets stored. We've got a fast-learning hippocampal system, but we have the limits of synapse saturation here, so we have to sleep to reset our synapses here. And we've got a limited number of cortical neurons and synapses, so we want to be selective about the information that gets stored in the cortex. Now, what kinds of things would brains be wise to store? Well, here's one category of events. Events that repeat are likely to be important. So if things are repeating in your life, these things are impacting your life repeatedly. And notice how that satisfies the condition for making strong synapses in the cortex. Those cortical neurons had lower plasticity. We needed multiple activations to strengthen those synapses. Well, repeating events in your life are then going to be well stored in your cerebral cortex. In addition, that sort of mimics what we're doing when we repeat a study session. So this is why repeating study sessions is important for generating long-term memories. We are, in a sense, sort of tricking the brain. The brain is designed so that these cortical neurons need multiple repetitions a lot of times to strengthen those synapses. Well, multiple study sessions will do just that. If we repeat our study sessions spaced out in time, we're going to give our brain the chance to make lots of nice, strong cortical synapses there that will store the information we're studying. In addition, events that are emotional are likely to be important. This is sort of one of the adaptive values of the different kinds of emotions. Emotional events, the brain regions that process emotions, they influence the memory systems. So emotional events increase the plasticity of hippocampal neurons, and so we make strong memory traces in the hippocampus when an event is an emotional event. And if you make strong hippocampal memory traces, system consolidation is going to store that kind of information well in the long-term system in the cortex. New events are likely to be important. So again, when we encounter something new, we've never seen it before, that's important information because that new thing might show up again later in our life, and this is how we're going to learn about our world if we can store information about new things that are happening. So again, when we encounter something new, hippocampal memory traces will be strong. System consolidation will store that information in the cortex. Surprising events are likely to be important. If we encounter something that's surprising, it means our model of the world is not quite accurate, and that is important to understand. So we thought the world worked one way, and now we discover it works a different way. That's important information to store. The hippocampal plasticity will be high, will make a good strong memory trace, and system consolidation will store that information in the cortex. So the daily details of life often don't rise to a level of significance, and so can be safely forgotten. Here we're noticing the sense of forgotten here is not sufficiently consolidated. So we can think of system consolidation as a process that selects information to be stored. It's the hippocampal memory traces that are formed during the day that are going to be used to strengthen cortical memory traces. But as we've just seen, the information stored, the memory traces in the hippocampus, will tend to be about important things. Unimportant things tend to just not make durable memory traces in the hippocampus, and so won't be available for system consolidation and storage in the cortex. So this system then sort of is biased towards storing important information in the cerebral cortex. And when we strengthen those cortical synapses, because they decay slowly, we'll be able to remember all of these important things that have happened to us. Now, again, when we go to school and we do book learning, we are sort of tricking the brain. We are setting up repeated study sessions so that we're going to be strengthening lots of synapses among allocated neurons that represent all the information we're studying. And if we do our studying well, we're going to have long-term memories for the information that we learned. So we'll finally bring this to an end with sort of how to study and when to study. So how to study, we've got to be attentive and focused to make strong hippocampal memory traces. If we're not paying attention, the hippocampal memory trace is not going to be strong. If we're stressed out, that can interfere with plasticity in the hippocampus. We need to be focused and attentive in order that what we're learning has a chance of making strong hippocampal memory traces. We want to use deep processing techniques to activate older memory traces that can be linked to the new memory traces. This is called elaboration. So when you're studying one particular topic, try to make connections to other things that you've already learned, so that then when system consolidation occurs, we can integrate all the new information with previously learned information. And this is how we generate a network of knowledge in our semantic memory. System consolidation is an important process. It's a process that helps to insert new knowledge into our already existing long-term memory system. We want to use deep processing techniques to strengthen cortical memory traces and their retrieval pathways. And this is what we're calling retrieval practice. So every time we retrieve a memory, we set up a possibility for further consolidation. We can strengthen those cortical memory traces. But in addition, when we practice retrieval, we're strengthening the retrieval pathways. Remember, even if we have well-consolidated memory traces in the cortex, we can lose access to that information if we don't retrieve that information often enough. So retrieval practice is doing double duty here. It's helping to strengthen cortical memory traces and strengthening the retrieval pathways to have quick, reliable access to that information. What about when to study? Well, basically after a delay. So we want to study when the hippocampus is prepared to learn, which means reduced synapse strength between hippocampal neurons as occurs after sleep. You'll recall we learned that sleep is thought to reset the hippocampal synapses. So we've got strong synapses here due to the day's learning. We're going to do system consolidation to strengthen the cortical memory traces, but then we're going to weaken the synapses in the hippocampus to prepare for new learning. See, we've got to, if we think of the hippocampal memory traces as sort of the teacher during system consolidation, we need to refresh the teacher. We need to get the teacher ready to learn. We need to weaken the hippocampal synapses so that they can be strengthened again for new learning. So it's a good idea then to space out your study sessions, study each day, really. So you have sleep in between. And that's going to mean that you're going to have new teachers each day. Although you're studying the same material, you'll have new hippocampal teachers, and you'll go through multiple rounds of system consolidation during sleep. So when we do a little studying each day, we are really giving the brain a chance to make strong cortical memory traces. Now, students often make a mistake when they study. They use prolonged study sessions. They study for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. Prolonged study sessions lose their effectiveness because hippocampal synapses have already reached a maximum strength. So you see, when you study material for, the first 15, 20, 30 minutes to an hour, you're already strengthening those hippocampal memory traces. These synapses now, they can't be strengthened anymore by further study. So we're wasting time where it's not efficient to prolong study sessions. What we want to do is take a break, right? We need to take a break or space out our study sessions, make them shorter, but have breaks in between, and then you'll have a new hippocampal teacher that will be prepared to process the new study session. So we want to do our studying in smaller chunks of time, separated by breaks, and then that's going to allow us to kind of have multiple hippocampal teachers that are making memory traces for the same information that we're studying. Then when we do system consolidation, we've got an extra punch up here to strengthen those cortical memory traces. So how to study: use deep processing techniques, elaboration, retrieval practices, etc. When to study: we need to study more often, but for shorter durations of time, separated by breaks.